Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Ashrafil Anbiya wal Mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Amma ba'd. Fa'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah, we have looked at thus far the faraiz, the obligatory acts of wuzu, things which are considered farz and obligatory in wuzu, without which your wuzu would not be done. And then afterwards we then went on to look at those things which are considered sunnats in wuzu, things which are considered mustahab and desirable in wuzu. Now inshallah, in today's lesson, lesson number 4, we will be looking at those things which breaks our wuzu. Things which if found, our wuzu will break and we will have to redo our wudu again. So in this section, we're going to look at things which necessitates wuzu. And this is how Imam Quduri rahmatullah begins the following text by saying, wal ma'ani an-naqidhatu lil wudu, i.e. those things which breaks the wuzu, which necessitates wuzu, which if found, your wuzu will break and you will have to redo the wudu all over again. Now what are they? Number 1, ma kharaja min as-sabilayn, things which exit your front and your back private parts, that breaks your wuzu. Straightforward, things which comes out from our front private parts, from our back private parts, that will break our wudu. So things such as urine. When we urinate, then that will break our wudu. Feces, these kind of things will break our wuzu. Even to the extent that if something small, like an insect, was to come out of our back private parts, then that will also break our wudu as well. Why? Because ma kharaja min as-sabilayn, because it has come out of our private parts. So basically anything which comes out of our private parts, whether it is urine, feces, whether it is wind, then all those things will break our wuzu and we will have to redo our wudu again. Now there is one exception, and the exception which the scholars and the fuqaha have described in Arabic with the words rihul qubul, which basically means wind from the front private parts. Now the ulamas, the scholars have written that wind which comes from the front private parts, that does not break your wuzu. So if it was to come from your back private part, then that will break your wuzu, no doubts regarding that. But if wind was to come from the front private part, then that does not break your wuzu. So sometimes some people, they may have this kind of illness or this kind of problem where they could feel wind coming out, but instead of going through the back passage, it goes through the front passage. So that in Arabic is known as rihul qubul, and the scholars have written that if rihul qubul happens, i.e. if wind is being passed from the front private parts, then your wuzu would not break. So that is number 1. Number 2, the second thing which breaks our wuzu is what dam. Dam basically means blood. So if you bleed, your wuzu will break. Now this is a very important topic here, because this is where a lot of people get confused that what do you mean by bleeding? That if I bleed, does that mean my wuzu is automatically broken or not? Now in the Hanafi fiqh, the Hanafi scholars have said that your wuzu will only break if the blood flows from its wound. So basically, the main thing which you need to look at in Arabic is called saylan. Saylan means flowing blood. So whatever the blood flows from its wound and from its place, then your wuzu will break. However, if you cut yourself or you scratched yourself and you could see that the skin has kind of gone from that area and you could actually see the blood, but that blood hasn't flown from its wound or from that particular place, then your wuzu is still intact. So just remember this key word, this key kind of masla here, and that is that only when the blood flows from its wound, only then your wuzu will break. If the blood doesn't flow, if it stays intact, if it stays within the wound, then your wuzu would not break. So that is one ruling. The second ruling is, like if you bleed in your mouth. So what happens that, just say some people, they have some gum problems and so on, and when they are doing wuzu or whenever they're doing miswak or brushing the teeth, they're always bleeding. So what happens with regards to bleeding in the mouth? Now, generally speaking, besides the mouth, anywhere else in the body or on the body, we look at salan. We look at whether the blood has flown from its wound or not. But if you're bleeding in your mouth, we don't look at flowing blood, but instead we look at predominance of blood over saliva for your wuzu to break. Just keep that in mind. So when you're bleeding in the mouth, then we look at whether there is more blood than the saliva for your wuzu to break. We don't look at whether it's flowing or not, because the mouth is an area, is a place which naturally is always wet. So we don't look at whether it's flowing or not, because obviously because it mixes with your saliva, it's going to flow. Just say for example, like you cut your gums or whatever, it's naturally going to flow because that area is wet. So therefore, we will only say that your wuzu has broken if there is more blood than the saliva. So just say for example, you're brushing your teeth or you're using miswak and then you're spitting, like that's happened that you spit some things out. Now, if there is more blood, say, than the saliva in the spit, then that means that your wuzu is broken. However, if there is more saliva than the blood, then in that situation, your wuzu would not break. So that is the second ruling here, and that is that with regards to bleeding in the mouth, we look at predominance. The third masla here is with regards to bleeding from the nose. Like some people, again, bleeding from the nose and so on. Some people, they have this kind of illness, in particular when it gets really hot and so on, they start bleeding from the nose. So again, bleeding from the nose, because that bleeding is coming from inside, and then it comes from that hole or the nostrils, or from the hole which is inside the nose, and then it comes running down. So because the blood has flown, so therefore your wuzu will break. However, another way or another angle to look at it is, some people, they may pick their noses and so on. They like put their fingers up their nose. Now, if they are putting their fingers up their nose, sometimes what happens is that when they take it out, they sometimes see some blood on their fingertips. Now, the question is, whether their wuzu is broken or not depends on whether whatever they touched, that area they've touched inside the nose, whether it's from a wound where the blood is flowing, or whether it's from a wound where the blood is not flowing. And the way it's easy to sometimes find out or to recognize whether it's a flowing blood or not is sometimes like when you put your fingers inside your nose and you take it out. Now, if it's a kind of like wettish kind of blood, like kind of like wet blood, then you know that area where you're bleeding from is in fact flowing blood. So therefore, your wuzu will break. However, for example, if you take your finger out and you see that there's some kind of dry blood here, or some specks of blood, then the most likelihood is that it's not flowing blood, but instead it's a dry blood there, or some kind of wound where the blood hasn't flown. So you just touch that, and that's why the specks of blood or the stain of blood is on your fingertips. So that is the third ruling with regards to putting your fingers in your nose or bleeding from your nose. The fourth ruling is with regards to sneezing. Similar to Masala number 3, is with regards to sneezing, that if you sneeze blood out, then what will be the ruling? So again, it depends of how you sneezed. That if you say, for example, you sneezed and some blood was flowing out, like for example, you sneezed and some drops of blood was coming out and it came out like in a flowing way, then in that situation, your wuzu will break. However, if you sneezed out dry clots of blood. Like sometimes after a while, like when you don't blow your nose, then all the snots or bogies which are inside your nose, it kind of gets dry and so on. So if someone sneezed and he was sneezing out dry clots of blood, then his wuzu would not break. Okay, so again, it's all based on that condition of saylan, i.e. flowing. If it's flowing, then your wuzu will break. Otherwise, it will not break. The next masala, masala number 5, is again with regards to blood stains after biting an apple or after using a toothpick. Again, sometimes when people, they got some bad gums, so what happens is that when they bite an apple or a pear or a banana or something like that, they always see some specks of blood on the apple or on the banana, on the pear, or even when they are using toothpick and so on. So there's always some traces of blood on the actual toothpick. So what is the masla with regards to that? The masla is that the stains which you see on a toothpick or on an apple will not break your wuzu, because they are just stains. They're not, it's not from a flowing wound or it's not from a flowing blood, but they're just like stains. So because of that reason, your wuzu would not break. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Whatever it's from a stain, because obviously, if there's a wound but the blood hasn't flown, but there's just like blood there, so it is obvious that if you're going to dab it with your finger, some stain is going to come onto your fingers. Okay, there's nothing like impossible about that. If you're going to dab the wound with your fingers, some specks of blood is going to come onto your fingers. But that is not enough or sufficient for us to then say that that person's wuzu is broken. We look at whether it was from a flowing blood for the wuzu to break or not. The next ruling here is with regards to squeezing blood out. So again, if you squeeze blood out, that doesn't break your wudu. Okay, just for example, you cut yourself and there's a gash here, there's a wound here, but the blood hasn't flown. So the blood is still there in its place and its area. So if you now get your skin and you're kind of squeezing the blood out and so on, so obviously again, when you're going to try and initiate the blood to come out and you're squeezing it, so it is obvious that 1 or 2 drops may come out, but that would not break the wuzu. So remember, it has to flow naturally. Okay, if there's a cut or a wound, it has to flow naturally for the wuzu to break. If you're going to squeeze the blood out, then that does not break your wuzu. And one final masla with regards to bleeding here is with regards to injections, that whether after you take an injection and so on, and some blood comes out, so whether your wuzu breaks or not. So the answer, as we have looked at, keeping in mind the aforementioned principle, will be that your wuzu will break. Because obviously, when you take an injection and when they take the needle out, so some blood does actually squirt out and it comes out. So because the blood has flown from its place, so therefore your wuzu will break. So that is the second thing which breaks your wuzu, i.e. waddam, i.e. bleeding. The third thing which breaks your wuzu is walqih was-sadid. So qih basically means pus, and sadid, which is also another type of pus, which in English is called cecum, S-E-C-U-M. That also breaks a wuzu as well. So sometimes what happens is that when you have a spot and so on, or a wound, so if you were to dab on that particular wound with something sharp or something like knife or something like that, then sometimes what happens is that some water comes out. So that water is called pus. So pus is similar to bleeding in terms of its ruling, that it's only when the pus flows from its place, that's when your wuzu will break. If it doesn't flow like blood, that is just in its place and so on, then the wuzu would not break. So it's only when the pus flows from its place, that's when the wuzu will break. There is another masla regarding pus here, and that is that sometimes what happens is that after a while, that pus, it dries up. And it dries up to such an extent that it becomes like snot. So just say, for example, you had a kind of a spot here, and then that pus, which was inside the spot, it dried up to such an extent that it becomes like snot. And then afterwards you then poke at the spot to such an extent that you then cut the spot, and then that dryish kind of pus comes out. So that dry pus which comes out, that does not break your wuzu. Okay? So it's only when it's flowing, like with water, when it flows, like blood, that's only then your wuzu will break. However, when it's like dry pus, when you then take that out, or when you are then extracting that out, then that does not break your wuzu. Another masla which we can develop from this third thing which breaks our wuzu is with regards to people who have what is known as a paining eye. Like sometimes what may happen is, as some people, they may have a spot which is like near to the eye and so on, which causes water to come out. So that water which comes out from a paining eye is also considered similar to pus. Eye is considered najas and impure, and that also breaks a wuzu as well. So paining eye here means like, I'm not sure, some of you may have experienced, or you may have seen some people that next to their eyes here, they may have a spot, and then obviously because they're blinking and so on, so what happens eventually is that that spot kind of bursts, which causes like water to come out. Okay, and sometimes it comes out from the eye itself. So water which comes out from a paining eye, or because your eye is hurting, then that also breaks your wuzu as well. Okay. However, this doesn't apply for onions though. Yeah, when you're cutting onions, and then you just naturally kind of like water comes out and so on. So that doesn't break your wuzu. We're talking about this specific scenario here where there's a spot next to your eyes, or for some other reason, for some other kind of illness, you got this paining eye where water is coming out, then that water is considered najas, and that will break your wuzu. However, obviously this doesn't apply when it comes to cutting onions and so on. So that is the second and third thing which breaks your wuzu, which is walqih was sadid, i.e. pus and cecum. Now the next thing which breaks our wuzu, number 4, is walqi idha kana mil al-fam. Vomit when it is equivalent to a mouthful. So the fourth thing which breaks your wuzu is that if you vomit, and if the vomit is equivalent to a mouthful. Now this is a very important condition here. The main condition which we apply in wudu, in contrast to fasting, is that in wudu, for your wuzu to break, if you vomit and the vomit is equivalent to a mouthful, your wuzu is broken. However, when it comes to fasting, then there are two conditions which needs to be found for your fast to break through vomiting. That is, number 1, it has to be a mouthful, and number 2, it has to be intentional. So if you intentionally, like whilst fasting I'm talking about now, that whilst fasting, if you intentionally vomit, and if you vomit equivalent to a mouthful, then your wuzu will break. However, when it comes to wudu, there's only one condition which needs to apply, and that condition is mil al-fam, if it's equivalent to a mouthful. So if you vomit equivalent to a mouthful, then your wuzu is broken. So from this we can understand that if a person, if he vomits, but he vomits less than a mouthful, then his wuzu would not break. Another masla I'm just going to mention here, I'm going to come back to this later on, but I'm just going to highlight it here. And that is that those things which does not break your wuzu, if that was to come out from your body, then that thing is not considered impure and it's not considered najas. So, for example, as I just mentioned, that if you vomit less than a mouthful, then your wuzu doesn't break. So therefore, that vomit which has come out of your mouth, that less than a mouthful vomit which has come out of your mouth, that is not considered najas, that is not considered impure. So therefore, if it comes onto your clothes, then you can read namaz with it without cleaning that. And the reason I'm mentioning this particular ruling is that sometimes, like in particular women, when they've got babies with them and so on, and sometimes the baby vomits some milk out and so on. So if it's a little bit of vomit and it comes onto her clothes, and then just say without realizing she then goes and reads her salah, then that namaz will be accepted. Why? Because that little bit of vomit which comes out less than a mouthful is not considered hadath, it's not considered najas, i.e. impure. So therefore, because it doesn't break your wudu, so therefore that thing which has come out would not be considered impure. So that is the masla here, that وَالْقَيْءِ إِذَا كَانَ مِنْ الْفَمِ. This takes me on to the next ruling with regards to vomiting. And that is that if someone vomits several times, so would we count the vomit up, and if it's equivalent to a mouthful, we'll say that, okay, that person's wuzu is broken or not. Now the scholars have said that if a person vomits several times, then we will gather the vomit up, and if it's equivalent to a mouthful, then his wuzu will break. But the condition is that this several, or this vomiting at separate intervals or in different times, has to be because of that same vomity feeling which he had before. Now what I mean by that is, just say for example, a person, he was like feeling sick and so on. He had that kind of, when you vomit, you have this kind of like feeling. So what he did was that he vomited a bit here. And then he still had the same feeling, and then a couple of steps on the right, he then vomited a bit again. Then with that same feeling, he then went and vomited somewhere else. So in that situation, we will count all that together, and if it's equivalent to a mouthful, then his wuzu will break. However, if he vomited a bit here, and then he felt better, and then half an hour, 1 hour later, he then vomits another half a mouthful somewhere else, then we won't count those two separate vomits together. Why? Because obviously the two vomits which he has done is because of a separate cause, a separate sabab, which was not because of the same vomity feeling which he was feeling earlier. So that is the fourth thing which breaks our wudu, and that is to vomit, which is equivalent to a mouthful. The fifth thing which breaks our wudu, as mentioned in the text, is وَالنَّوْمُ مُسْتَجِعًا أَوْ مُتَّكِيًا أَوْ مُسْتَنِدًا إِلَى شَيْءٍ, which means to sleep lying down, أَوْ مُتَّكِيًا, or to lean against something, أَوْ مُسْتَنِدًا إِلَى شَيْءٍ, or to recline against something. So when a person falls asleep, then his wuzu breaks. Now I'm not going to actually look at the words in the text. What I'll do is I'm just going to mention what the mufta bihi qawl is. Mufta bihi qawl means that what the ulamas and the scholars or the jurists have said with regards to sleeping. Now in the Hanafi fiqh, there are two opinions with regards to sleeping. The first opinion is that we will look at the thing which he is leaning on, or the thing which he is leaning against. So we will look at the thing which he is leaning against. Now what I mean by that is, just say for example, if a person is leaning against, say, a chair or against something, then what we will do is that we will apply an objective test. And we will ask ourselves that if we were to move that chair from that person, would he collapse to the floor straight away or not? So just imagine there's a chair next to me, and I'm just leaning against that chair, and I fell asleep. Now what will happen is that we will apply an objective test, and that is that we will see that, okay, if we were to move that chair, would he just collapse on the floor or not? If he does, like for example, we move the chair and then he collapses straight away onto the floor, then that is a sign that he must have been in a heavy, deep sleep, hence his wuzu will break. However, if for example we move the chair and then he quickly kind of like regains his consciousness and his awareness of everything, then that is a sign that he was not in a deep sleep, hence his wuzu will not break. So that is the first thing scholars look at, is we look at the thing which he is reclining against or leaning against, and if he were to move that, then he would collapse straight away, then that is a sign that he was in a deep sleep, hence his wuzu will break. However, if we were to move it and then all of a sudden he wakes up straight away, then that is a sign that he was not in a deep sleep, hence his wuzu will not break. Sometimes what happens is that you may be in the mosque or something, and you're kind of like falling asleep, or you're kind of like knocking your head to the, side or, down and so on. And then what happens is that somebody comes and he just brushes his body against you, and you just all of a sudden just wake up. So that is a sign that you were not in a deep sleep, hence your wuzu will not break. Okay, so that is the first test which we apply, is that we will look at the thing which is leaning against. The second thing which some scholars have said is that we will look at his maq'ad, i.e. his buttocks and his backside. Now what I mean by that is that if his buttocks and backside is firmly on the ground, because remember the reason why we consider sleeping to break your wuzu is because what happens is that when you fall asleep, then your whole body, everything relaxes, your muscles relax. So you are more prone, or you are more likely to release gas, to release wind, which obviously breaks your wudu. So therefore, the second test we apply is that whether his buttocks is firmly on the ground or not. So someone who's like sitting down like cross-legged and so on. So when he is sitting down cross-legged, because his buttocks is firmly on the ground, there is no possibility or there is no opportunity for any wind and any gas to leave his backside. So therefore, as long as his buttocks is firmly on the ground, we will say that he is in the state of wudu. However, if he is sleeping, say, like this way in tashahhud position, so because his buttock is off the ground, so if he was to fall asleep like this in that particular position, then his wuzu will break. So that is the second test we apply, is that if his buttocks and backside is firmly on the ground, and there is no opportunity, no chance of any wind passing, then we will consider that person's wuzu to be intact. However, if his buttocks is off the ground, then because there is now an opportunity and a possibility of wind to pass from that area, so therefore his wuzu will break. Now there are two opinions I mentioned, so you may be thinking that which one do we act upon? Now the Hanafi jurists have said that you can act upon whichever one you want. You can act upon both of the opinions. It's preferable to act upon the first opinion. However, in necessities or whatever there is a need, you can also act upon the second opinion as well. And what I mean by need, example of need will be that you may have been traveling. Like just say you're going, say from, by coach from Birmingham to London. So you were sitting in the coach, sitting obviously on the seat, your buttocks firmly on the seat. Now, in that state, you fell asleep for a couple of hours. Now you then wake up and it's Zohar time or it's Asr time and so on. And you're in the middle of some, I don't know, somewhere or service station, or you're just middle of nowhere. Just say like you're just still, the coach is just going and it's not going to stop for you and Asr is about to finish. And there's no possibility for you to do wuzu. You can't stop the coach and say, oh, let me do wuzu and so on. So in that situation, if we were to act upon the second opinion, which is that as long as your buttocks is firmly on the seat or on the ground, your wuzu is intact. So therefore, in that situation, where you were in the coach, you can act upon the second opinion and you can read salah without redoing your wudu. Okay, because obviously we will take the second opinion because there's more easiness in that opinion for us to act upon. Okay, but if it's like, for example, scenarios where there is water available and so on, and you did fall asleep like that, then it's preferable for you to actually go and redo your wuzu. Another example I may give where you may need to, or you may want to act upon the second opinion, will be like in Hajj or in Umrah. Those have been for Hajj or Umrah. What may happen is that you need to go a couple of hours early to the masjid so that you could get a place so that you can read namaz in the haram or in Masjid Nabawi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if you, like just say you went early to the masjid and you sat down and then you were in that cross-legged position and you fell asleep. Sometimes it happens that because you're so tired and so on, you fell asleep for half an hour, for 1 hour and so on. Now you woke up, there's 5 minutes left before namaz. Now it's going to be impossible for you to actually go to your hotel or even go to the wuzu area there because there's going to be so many people and it's going to be so packed out and so on. So in that situation, if you were to act upon the second opinion, and that is that as long as your buttocks was on the ground and you fell asleep, your wuzu will be intact and you don't have to redo the wuzu. So these are a couple of opinions with regards to sleeping. The next thing, which is masala number 6, or the sixth situation where your wuzu breaks, is وَالْغَلْبَةُ عَلَى الْأَقْلِ بِالْإِغْمَاءِ وَالْجُنُونِ. which basically means loss of consciousness through fainting and insanity. So when a person, when he becomes unconscious, bil ighma, whether it is through fainting, like he faints, or wal junoon, or whether it's through insanity. So someone, he becomes pagal, he becomes majnoon, someone he faints and so on. So in those 2-3 situations, what will happen is a person's wuzu breaks. And the reason why is that when a person becomes mad or majnoon, or when a person in particular, when he faints, then what happens is that he's got no control over his body anymore. And when he's got no control over his body, then as I mentioned before, all your body relaxes and there is more of a chance and a likelihood that some wind is released from your backside. So because of that reason, loss of consciousness through fainting, wal junoon, or through insanity, that will also break your wuzu as well. Couple of things with regards to that. Number one is, if a person drinks alcohol, then does his wuzu break or not? Now, with regards to drinking alcohol, it depends on whether he becomes drunk or unconscious. If he drinks alcohol, but he's still okay, he knows what's happening and so on, then his wuzu doesn't break. However, if he, for example, he drank alcohol and because of that reason he's become drunk and he's lost his marbles, shall I say, and he's not sure what to do and so on, like he's lost his mind, then in that situation his wuzu will break. And the same rule also applies for taking drugs as well. Now, if he was taking drugs and because of that reason he kind of lost his mind and so on, then in that situation his wuzu will break. However, if you still aware, conscious of everything, then his wuzu would not break. Another masla here is something which is known as blackouts. Now, what is the way blackout, some of you may have experienced it, is that you're just walking or you're just doing your normal thing, and then all of a sudden you just like get this kind of feeling where you just have to, it's all like, you just lose, like basically, you don't lose consciousness, you know what's everything around you, but you just, this kind of like feeling where your mind is overpowered somehow. You're still conscious of everything, you still know what's happening, but you just have to like put your head down for a few seconds and after that you get better. Or sometimes you may walk on the street and then you get this kind of overpowering of your brain or something for a matter of seconds, and after that you just get your consciousness back and so on. Now with regards to blackout, because as I just indicated that you don't actually lose your consciousness, you know what's happening, you know what's everything around you, but just for that 1 second or so, something happens to your brain where you experience this kind of blackout for a second or so. So because you're still conscious of everything, so blackouts does not break your wuzu. Okay, so if you have blackouts, or if you experience blackouts for a second or so, then that does not break your wuzu. Remember, you'll only break your wuzu if it totally makes you unconscious, totally overpowers you to the extent that you then faint on that spot, then that will break your wuzu. However, just for a second or so, as long as you were aware of everything, conscious of everything, then that would not break your wuzu. And the last thing which is mentioned in the book which breaks your wuzu is وَالْقَحْقَحَةُ فِي كُلِّ صَلَاةِ ذَاتِ رُكُوعٍ وَسُجُودٍ. Basically, to laugh loudly in namaz, in such a namaz which consists of ruku and sajda. So, the last ruling here is that if a person, if he was to laugh loudly in salah or in namaz, and this namaz is such that it consists of ruku and sajda, then his wuzu will break. Now, a few points here. The first point is that if you laugh loudly in salah, your namaz will break. And the evidence and the proof for this particular masla is found in a hadith which can be found in Tabrani, where it's narrated by Abu Musa al-Ashari radhiyallahu anhu, that once Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was leading the Sahabas in prayer, when a man, he was blind, he entered the mosque or Masjid al-Nabawi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he fell into a hole which was in the masjid, i.e. the Masjid al-Nabawi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So basically, a blind Sahabi came in, and what happened was that he didn't see the hole which was in front of him, and he accidentally he fell inside that particular hole. Now when that happened, the Sahabas who were reading the Salah, they started laughing. So after Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam completed the prayer, he ordered those who laughed to repeat the Salah and the wuzu. So he told them that you need to do your wuzu again, and also you need to repeat the Salah. So from this particular hadith, we can see that if a person, if he laughs in Salah, then his wuzu will break, and because his wuzu broke, his namaz will also break at the same time. A couple of other things regarding this particular masla. That number two, the second thing regarding this masla is that this masla or ruling applies only for adults. So it doesn't apply for kids or children or immature children. So sometimes like when you go to mosques and so on and you see like little kids laughing in namaz and so on, so their wuzu will not break in that situation, okay? So it only applies for those who are mature and those who are adults. And the third point with regards to this masla is that it only applies in those prayers which consists of ruku and sajda. Basically your normal prayers, your 5 daily prayers, your Jummah Salah, your Eid Salah, and so on, which consists of ruku and sajda, this masla arises only for those. Those salahs which does not consist of ruku and sajda, such as Salatul Janaza, so if somebody was to laugh loudly in the Janaza Salah, then his wuzu would not break. So these are three things which we need to keep in mind when it comes to laughing loudly in Salah. Number one is that it has to be done by a mature person, a baligh person. The Salah has to consist of ruku and sajda. And number three, it has to be, so actually these are the two main things, okay? And obviously as I mentioned before that if children or immature children were to laugh, then this particular ruling would not apply for them. Now this word here, qahqaha, or laughing loudly, laughing here means laughing in such a way where the person next to you can hear you. If you, say for example, laughed in Salah, but in such a way where you heard the laugh yourself, but not the person next to you, then in that situation, the namaz will break, but not your wuzu. So what you'll have to do in that situation is just start the Salah all over again. And if a person smiled in namaz, then in that situation, his wuzu and at the same time his namaz would not break. So just keep that in mind. Smiling in namaz doesn't break your wuzu and your namaz. Laughing, but in such a way where you've heard the laugh and not the person next to you, that will break your namaz, not your wuzu. And laughing loudly or hysterically or in such a way where the person next to you can hear you, that will break your wuzu and that will also break your namaz. And this ruling with regards to laughing loudly, again, it's one of those objective tests, meaning that just because you're reading namaz by yourself in a room and you laugh loudly, so you can't say, oh, the person next to me is not here, so he didn't hear me, so therefore my namaz is still intact. No. The ruling is that it's an objective test that if a person was next to you, would he have been able to hear that laugh or not? And if the answer is yes, then your wuzu will break and also the namaz will break. However, if, for example, if it wasn't that loud, then in that situation, your wuzu and your namaz will not break. Now, I'm just going to mention some other things which is not actually mentioned here about things which breaks your wuzu and things which does not break your wuzu. Another masla here is with regards to things which breaks your wuzu is something which is known as a smear test. Now obviously women to check whether they've got cancer or not, so what happens is that every now and then they have a smear test where the nurse or whoever, they will insert something into their private parts. Now smear test breaks their wuzu, but ghusl does not become compulsory. Okay, so when they insert something into their private parts, then obviously as we're going to look at later, that obviously, like for example, if a man was having sexual intercourse with her and he inserted his private parts into her, then obviously ghusl will become compulsory in that situation. But in this situation here, when they've inserted that kind of stick or something inside the private parts to check whether she's got cancer or not, then there's no ghusl compulsory for her. However, wuzu is compulsory. Her wuzu will break. Also, another ruling here is that, just say for example, if someone, or if a woman, or if a man, say, if he inserted his fingers, or if the woman inserted her own fingers into her private parts, then again, that will only break a wuzu, and ghusl would not be compulsory. Okay, inshallah, we'll look at these rulings next week when we touch on the issue regarding ejaculation and so on, like which kind of things will break a wuzu. So if a man, like out of foreplay, he inserted his fingers into his wife's private parts, or if the wife did it herself, then in that situation, her wuzu will break, but ghusl would not be compulsory. Some of the things which, but this time, these things does not break a wuzu. Number one, kissing. Now, does kissing break a wuzu or not? So, just kissing your wife, say on her cheek or whatever, then that does not break your wuzu as long as from the man no semen or anything comes out, or no mazi or no kind of liquid comes out, because obviously if some liquid comes out, then his wuzu will break, as we're going to look at in next week's lesson. So if he just kisses his wife, just like gives a peck on a cheek or something like that, then that does not break her wuzu, and also it does not break your wuzu. Okay. Another ruling here is with regards to touching your private parts. Now, touching your private parts does not break your wuzu. Okay, so if you touch your private parts, whether there was like no barrier in between and you just touched your private parts, or whether there was a pants in between, whatever. So both situations, touching your private parts does not break your wuzu. Similarly, looking at your private parts does not break your wuzu. Okay, so just say again, if you're in the state of wuzu and you looked at your private parts and so on, so again, it does not break your wuzu. Obviously, you shouldn't look at your private parts all the time, because obviously, that's not something advisable or something like, rewardable, shall I say. But obviously, if you did by accident or something, then that does not break your wuzu. And another ruling here is that if a woman breastfeeds her child, then her wuzu doesn't break. Okay, remember, anything which comes out of your body which is najas, impure, that breaks the wuzu, like we looked at thus far, such as bleeding, such as pus, these kind of things, that breaks the wuzu. Vomit, that breaks the wuzu. However, the milk which comes out from a breast, milk is considered pure, pak. So therefore, when she's breastfeeding the child, then that does not break your wuzu. Similarly, like if there's like some milk which is on her like bras or something like that around that area, then again that does not affect the validity of a salah. So breastfeeding, that does not break your wuzu. Some of the rulings here, just one or two before we finish. Eczema. So eczema has the same rule as, or same ruling as pus, which we looked at before. Okay, so if someone's got eczema problem and so on, some water comes out, then that has the same ruling as that before. And if a person has an epilepsy fit, then again that has the same ruling as fainting. So if someone like collapses or has a fit and so on, which leads to him falling unconscious, then in those situations, his wuzu will break. Shall we just leave it there for this week? Inshallah, that actually concludes the wuzu section, and inshallah from next week we will be looking at the ghusl section, things where are the compulsory acts of ghusl, and more importantly, when does ghusl become compulsory? So inshallah that will be looked at in next week's lesson. May Allah subhanahu gives the tawfiq to act upon what has been said. Wa akhiru da'wan alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Any questions or